What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. We are back. So in this video we are going to finish level 1 of our photographs iceberg. It was a ton of fun getting to make the first part of this, so I'm excited to be back with the second part. Let's not waste any time, let's get right into it. Alright y'all, let's get this part 2 of our level 1 started. Our first image is the 1968 Olympics Black Power Salute. So during their medal ceremony in the Olympic Stadium in Mexico City on October 16, 1968, two African-American athletes, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, each raised a black gloved fist during the playing of the U.S. national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. While on the podium, Smith and Carlos, who had won gold and bronze medals respectively in the 200-meter running event of the 1968 Summer Olympics, turned to face the U.S. flag and then kept their hands raised until the anthem had finished. In addition, Smith, Carlos, and Australian silver medalist Peter Norman all wore human rights badges on their jackets. In his autobiography, Silent Gesture, published nearly 30 years later, Smith revised his statement that the gesture was not a Black Power salute per se, but rather a human rights salute. The demonstration is regarded as one of the most overtly political statements in the history of the modern Olympics. So that is a very iconic photo, really cool, really nice history behind it. This is actually the first time I'm learning anything about this, so this is exciting. Let's move on. Our next image is called The Brown Lady of Raynham Hall, and it is a ghost that reportedly haunts Raynham Hall in Norfolk, England. It became one of the most famous hauntings in the United Kingdom when photographers from Country Life magazine claim that they have captured this image, the Brown Lady. The Brown Lady is so named because of the brown brocade dress it is claimed she wears. According to the legend, the Brown Lady of Raynham Hill is the ghost of Dorothy Walpole, the sister of Robert Walpole, generally regarded as the first Prime Minister of Great Britain. She was the second wife of Charles Townshend, 2nd Viscount Townshend, who was notorious for his violent temper. The story says that when Townshend discovered that his wife had committed adultery with Lord Wharton, he punished her by locking her in her rooms in the family home, Raynham Hall. According to Mary Wortley Montagu, Dorothy was in fact entrapped by the Countess of Wharton. She invited Dorothy over to stay for a few days, knowing that her husband would never allow her to leave, not even to see her children. She remained at Raynham Hall until her death in 1726 from smallpox. Now I will admit that for me, this is probably the creepiest photo in the first part of the iceberg. I will admit that I think a lot of the images in this level 1 of the iceberg tend to be a little bit more intriguing, interesting, really cool. You know, there is some dark, but like a lot of them lack the creepy factor, and I think for me this image in particular starts to amplify that creepy factor, so I do appreciate that. Let's move on though. So our next photo is the Albert Einstein tomb photo. The image that The Guardian calls arguably one of the best known press photographs of any 20th century personality was taken on March 14, 1951, Einstein's birthday. The scientist was leaving his 72nd birthday party at Princeton University, which had been swarming with photographers and was understandably tired of smiling all night. As he left the event and climbed into the backseat of a car between Dr. Frank Adelot, the former head of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University, and Adelot's wife, Marie Jeanette, another throng of reporters and photographers advanced. Einstein was in no mood. According to the legend, he shouted, "That's enough," but they didn't listen. Out of exasperation and maybe a little spite, Einstein stuck his tongue out at the crowd, then immediately turned away. Arthur Sass from UPI was lucky enough to capture the split-second shot. This is iconic. When I see this image, I can't help but think of like a tote bag or something like that, or this image being like ironically screen printed on mugs or souvenir t-shirts, which is kind of crappy given how awesome the history is behind this image, but I digress. Let's move on. Our next photo, or technically selection of photos for this entry, is the images of the Golden Record. The images of the Golden Record are images that are electronically placed on phonograph records, which are carried on board the Voyager 1 and 2 spacecraft. The contents of the record were selected for NASA by a committee chaired by Carl Sagan of Cornell University et al. Dr. Sagan and his associates assembled 115 images and a variety of natural sounds such as those made by surf, wind, and thunder, birds, whales, and other animals. To this, they added musical selections from different cultures and eras and spoken greetings from Earth people in 55 languages, and printed messages from President Carter and UN Secretary General Waldom. Each record is encased in a protective aluminum jacket, together with a cartridge and a needle. Instructions in symbolic language explain the origin of the spacecraft and indicate how the record is to be played. The 115 images are encoded in analog form. The remainder of the record is in audio, designed to be played at 16-2/3 revolutions per minute. It contains the spoken greetings beginning with Akkadian, which was spoken in Sumer about 6,000 years ago, and ending with Wu, a modern Chinese dialect. Following the section on the sounds of Earth, there's an electric 90-minute selection of music, including both Eastern and Western classics and a variety of ethnic music. Once the Voyager spacecraft leaves the solar system, they will find themselves in empty space. It will be 40,000 years before they make a close approach to any other planetary system. So that is awesome. So it looks like if aliens are to find this, they're going to have a very interesting, I guess, brief and maybe wholly empty or wholly limited history of the entire Earth. I mean, I guess you can only summarize the entire Earth and the diversity of it in 115 images. You're going to miss a lot of things, but this is cool nonetheless. So for this one, we've obviously included a couple images from the 115 images that were selected. We did put up a few. We weren't able to get all of them. Let's move on. So our next entry is Abraham Lincoln's portrait. So the photographer of this portrait is actually Alexander Gardner, and he was a Scottish photographer who immigrated to the United States in 1856, where he began to work full-time in that profession. He is best known for his photographs of the American Civil War and the US President Abraham Lincoln, which obviously denotes this post or this entry into the iceberg, and of the conspirators and the execution of the participants in the Lincoln assassination plot. Abraham Lincoln became the president of the U.S. on November 1860, and during the election, along with his election, came the threat of war. So Gardner was well positioned in Washington, D.C. to document the pre-war events, and his popularity rose as a portrait photographer, capturing the visages of soldiers leaving for war. So this is an iconic. I feel like when we think of Lincoln, you're probably envisioning his face to look something like this one, so that is cool to have a little bit more context behind that. Our next image is of Pluto. For this entry, I actually don't have a ton of history behind the photo, more so a history on the subject, more or less. So this is going to be more about the planet and less about the image, yet still very interesting and I think worth listening to. But Pluto is a dwarf planet in the Kuiper Belt, a ring of bodies beyond the orbit of Neptune. It is the 9th largest and 10th most massive known object to directly orbit the Sun. It is the largest known trans-Neptunian object by volume by a small margin, slightly less massive than Eris. Like other Kuiper Belt objects, Pluto is made primarily of ice and rock and is much smaller than the inner planets. Compared to Earth's moon, Pluto has only 1/6 its mass and 1/3 its volume. Pluto has a moderately eccentric and inclined orbit ranging from 30 to 49 astronomical units or 7.3 billion kilometers. But who's counting? From the Sun. Light from the Sun takes 5.5 hours to reach Pluto at its average distance of 39.5 astronomical units or 3.67 billion miles. Pluto's eccentric orbit periodically brings it closer to the Sun than Neptune, but a stable orbital resonance prevents them from colliding. Pluto has 5 known moons. Charon, the largest, whose diameter is just over half that of Pluto, Styx, Nix, Cerberus, and Hydrus. Pluto and Charon are sometimes considered a binary system because the barycenter of their orbits does not lie within either body, and they are tidally locked. The New Horizons mission was the first spacecraft to visit Pluto and its moons, making a flyby on July 14, 2015, and taking detailed measurements and observations. So that is cool. That is very cool that we are still learning about Pluto, probably within the last 10-15 years, and probably still are to this day, and probably will for years to come. So that is awesome. Pluto was discovered in 1930, the first object in the Kuiper Belt. It was immediately hailed as the 9th planet, but its planetary status was questioned when it was found to be much smaller than expected. These doubts increased following the discovery of additional objects in the Kuiper Belt starting in the 1920s, and particularly the more massive scattered disk object IRIS in 2005. In 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, formally redefined the term planet to exclude dwarf planets such as Pluto. Many planetary astronomers, however, continue to consider Pluto and other dwarf planets to be planets. This is cool. I think it's really nice to have lived through this change in how we are taught about the planets. So when I was a kid, when I was a baby, when I was still in elementary school, Pluto was a planet. But by the time I was in high school, Pluto was no longer a planet. And for so many people now, they're going to live in a world where Pluto has never been a planet. And I get to live in, a world, my timeline is one where I got to see that change happen. So that is really cool. Our next photo is called The Roaring Lion and is a black and white photographic portrait of 67-year-old Winston Churchill as Prime Minister of the UK. The portrait was taken in 1941 by American-Canadian photographer Yusuf Karsh in the center block on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. So the photograph was shot on December 30th, 1941 in the Speaker's Chamber of the Canadian Speaker of the House of Commons at Parliament in Ottawa, after Churchill delivered his "Some Chicken, Some Neck" speech on World War II to Canadian members of Parliament. The brief photo session was arranged by the Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. Churchill is particularly noted for his posture and facial expression, which have been compared to the wartime feelings that prevailed in the UK, persistence in the face of an all-out conquering army. The photo session was only the last 2 minutes. Karsh asked the Prime Minister to put down a cigar as the smoke would interfere with the image. Churchill refused, so just before taking the photograph, Karsh quickly moved toward the Prime Minister and said, "Forgive me, sir," while snatching the cigar from his subject's mouth. According to Karsh, by the time I got back to the camera, he looked so belligerent, he could have devoured me. His scowl has been compared to a fierce glare as if confronting the enemy. Following the taking of the photo, Churchill stated, "You can even make a roaring lion stand still to be photographed," thus giving the picture its notable name. See, that is cool. So moments like these make these videos really interesting and the research worth it, because I didn't understand the title, and now reading it, I do get a better understanding of what that is. So I do appreciate getting to live through that and to learn a little bit about this. I actually don't know a ton about Churchill, but this photo does look pretty iconic nonetheless. Let's move on. Our next image is the Muhammad Ali defeat Sonny Liston image. So again, for this entry, I have more about the actual event than the photo itself. But the two fights between Muhammad Ali and Sonny Liston for boxing's World Heavyweight Championship were among the most controversial fights in the sport's history. Sports Illustrated magazine named their first meeting the Liston-Clay fight. Ali had not yet changed his name from Cassius Clay as the fourth greatest sports moment of the 20th century. The first bout was held on February 25th, 1964 in Miami Beach, Florida. Clay, who was an 8-1 underdog, won in a major upset when the champion gave up at the opening of the 7th round. Their second fight was in May 1965 in Lewiston, Maine, which Ali won with a first-round knockout. Talk about a comeback. The infamous Phantom Punch was, as well as a botched countdown by the referee, aroused suspicions of a fix and have been subject to debate ever since. Now, I would be willing to bet there's probably a ton of boxing channels that have a lot of great videos on this subject. So if you are interested, YouTube will definitely be able to quench your thirst on this topic. Let's move on. Our next entry is the Cotton Mill Girl. In 1906, the National Child Labor Committee hired Lewis Lane, already known for his photographs of immigrant families arriving on Ellis Island and steelworkers in Pittsburgh, to document scenes of child labor. In a South Carolina cotton mill, Hine discovered 48-inch tall. That's so weird. Actually, I need to... That's so funny. That's like, what is that, 4 feet? Why can't they just say 4 feet? Why describe someone's height in inches like that? Discovered 48-inch tall Sadie Pfeiffer and photographed her directly next to the dangerous machinery that she faced each day. Though she is bathed in light, her small form is nearly overwhelmed by the rows of spools in front of her, their repeating forms evoking the monotonous mechanical nature of factory work. Hine's images originally appeared in periodicals, posters, and booths at anti-child labor conventions. In 1914, 35 states ruled to prohibit the employment of children under the age of 14 and to require an 8-hour workday for individuals under 16. These photographs therefore represent one of the first instances of photography helping to enact social change. See, that's cool. That's cool because then it starts to create this idea that like photography can create change and is powerful enough to do that. So that is awesome. Now, one of the things that I find a little ironic and in kind of a messed up way. So I live in Wisconsin, and when I first moved here, I was shocked at how many places here are run by like kids like under 18. And I'm like impressed, but at the same time, I'm like, this is a little bit dystopian. Our next entry is the Marilyn Monroe skirt image. 60 years ago today, Marilyn Monroe mesmerized a crowd of lucky onlookers while her white dress blew suggestively above her knees and sometimes over her head. It was 1954, and the director Billy Wilder was filming a scene of the film The 7-Year Itch on Lexington Ave between 52nd and 53rd Street in New York City. In the script, Monroe and the co-star Tom Ewell exit a movie theater and a breeze from the subway passing below lifts Monroe's skirt. Instead of rushing to cover her legs as any decent woman of that era would have, Monroe exclaims, "Isn't it delicious?" Even if you have not seen the film, you have seen the photographs. The whole world has for decades, although not everyone knows the history behind the photographs or the name of the photographer who had the flying skirt idea in the first place. Melissa Stevens, the granddaughter of photographer Sam Shaw, shares her grandfather's experience with the blonde bombshell. That's awesome. That's really cool. That's a fun history to learn about. Let's move on to our next entry. Dewey defeats Truman. The photo depicts President Truman holding an early edition of the November 4, 1948 Chicago Daily Tribune showing an erroneous presidential election headline, so it was wrong in this case. Dewey defeats Truman was an incorrect banner headline on the front page of the Chicago Daily Tribune, later Chicago Tribune, on November 3, 1948, the day after incumbent U.S. President Harry S. Truman won an upset victory over his opponent Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York in the 1948 presidential election. It was famously held up by Truman at a stop at St. Louis Union Station following his successful election, smiling triumphantly at the error. The Chicago Daily Tribune, which had once referred to Democratic candidate Truman as a nincompoop, was a famously Republican-leaning paper. In a retrospective article some 60 years later about the newspaper's most famous and embarrassing headline, the Tribune wrote that Truman had as low an opinion of the Tribune as it did of him. So kind of a slapback little moment there. For about a year prior to the 1948 election, the printers who operated the linotype machines at the Chicago Tribune and other Chicago papers had been on strike in protest of the Taft-Hartley Act. Around the same time, the Tribune had switched to a method by which copy for the paper was composed on typewriters, photographed, and then arranged onto the printing plates. This process required the paper to go to press several hours earlier than usual, probably leading to the error. So I hope they fix that after. Alright guys, let's continue. So this next entry is going to be a bit of a long one. I opted to keep it long because I think it's a very interesting story, and cutting it would take away from what is essentially a very gnarly story. Elian Gonzalez is a Cuban technician who as a child became embroiled in a heated international custody and immigration controversy in 2000 involving the governments of Cuba and the US. His father, Juan Miguel Gonzalez Quintana, his other relatives in Cuba and in Miami and Miami's Cuban community. Gonzalez's mother, Elizabeth Brotons Rodriguez, drowned in November 1999 while attempting to leave Cuba with Gonzalez and her boyfriend to get to the US. Elian Gonzalez was 5 years old when found nestled in an inner tube floating at sea 3 miles from Florida's Fort Lauderdale coast. 2 fishermen found Elian and reluctantly handed him over to the U.S. Coast Guard as they feared he would be sent back to Cuba under the wet feet, dry feet policy since he had not yet reached land. The Coast Guard assured them that Elian would be taken ashore for medical reasons, deeming him eligible to stay. Elian was immediately taken to the hospital and treated for dehydration and minor cuts on his body. It was later found that Elian's mother, Elizabeth Broton Rodriguez, and Lázaro Monero Garcia, her common-law husband, had escaped Cardenas, Cuba, as part of a group with 14 refugees on a 17-foot boat. However, the others died in a storm while a young couple escaped to the shore and Elian was found. Once he had been treated, the Immigration and Naturalization Services provided Elian with a temporary deferral regarding his inspection and further released Elian to his great-uncle Lázaro Gonzalez, who lived with his family in Miami's Little Havana. These relatives informed the family in Cardenas to prepare for an extreme hardship visa waiver. The former were told the next day that some functionary of the government would be coming to get the boy, as a result of Fidel Castro's having met with Juan Miguel, Elian's father. The involvement of the Cuban Communist leader in the case of the subsequent diplomatic note written to the U.S. Department of State emphasizing that the father's demand for Elian's repatriation attracted international attention. This is because Elian had become a symbol to many exiles, reminding them of the solidarity of the Cuban exile community and its privileged status with economic refugee criteria. While Elian escaped both Cuba and death, he soon entered custody battles waged by his father, Miami relatives, and state officials from the U.S. and Cuba. The international tug-of-war waged between the Cuban and American relatives and state officials can be understood through the agendas of Fidel Castro, the Cuban-American Uncle Lázaro Gonzalez representing the Miami relatives and the Miami Cuban expat community, and the U.S. government representative Attorney General Janet Reno. In the case of Fidel Castro, he sought to showcase his power by first issuing an ultimatum to the U.S. that the boy should be returned to his father within 72 hours. On January 10, 2000, a Florida state court had ruled that the Florida Family Court was able to decide the merit of motion related with temporary custody by Lázaro Gonzalez, stating that Elian should stay with Miami relatives until a further custody hearing. However, Reno declared that the federal courts are responsible for deciding this case and that the Miami relatives must appeal to the federal court. Here, the objective of Reno was to provide the relatives with a chance to provide any information they could that would be relevant in the decision. She then emphasized that the INS commissioner had declared that the father speaks for the son and that his wishes were to have his son returned to him. I do believe this is where the story ends, but like I said, this is a very interesting history for such an iconic photo, and I couldn't see myself cutting it any shorter. If anything, it could have gone longer, but that would make it its own video, and we've got a ton of entries to get to, so let's move on. Our next entry is of the actual iceberg itself, the iconic image of the iceberg, which sparked this entire movement. So this is Ralph Cleavenger's Iceberg. All right, our next image is the time-traveling hipster. So this is a photograph from 1941 of a genuine authenticity of the reopening of the South Fork Bridge in Golden Bridge, British Columbia, and was alleged to show a time traveler. It was claimed that his clothing and sunglasses were of the present day and not of the styles worn in the 40s. Further research suggested that the present-day appearance of the man may not have been so new. The style of sunglasses first appeared in the 1920s. On first glance, the man is taken by many to be wearing a printed t-shirt, but on close inspection, it seems to be a sweater with a sewn-on emblem, the kind of clothing often worn by sports teams of the period. The shirt is very similar to the one that was used by the Montreal Maroons, an ice hockey team from that era. The remainder of his clothing would appear to have been available at the time, though his clothes are far more casual than those worn by the other individuals in the photograph. The time-traveling hipster became a case study in viral internet phenomena in museums, which was presented at the Museums and the Web 2011 conference in Philly, Pennsylvania. Now this is a cool image too. I remember watching like a Good Mythical Morning video about this or something and being obsessed and like being very almost convinced that time travel exists. And I'm not saying that it doesn't, but this is one of those times where I'm like, wow, this seems like it is proof. I wonder what adding some color, using AI to add color to the image, what that would do, if that would make it obvious that it's obviously not a time-traveling hipster, or if it would just increase the conspiracy and the cult following around this image. Let's move on. Our last image for this iceberg is the woman with the handbag, and it is photograph taken by, so the woman with the handbag is a photograph taken in Vaxjö, Sweden on April 13th, 1985 by photojournalist Hans Runsen. It depicts a 38-year-old woman, Danuta Danielson, hitting a marching neo-Nazi with a handbag. According to scholar Samuel Merrill, the photograph became popular for three reasons. It captures what Henri Cartier-Bresson called the decisive moment of an action or composition. It anticipates and insinuates rather than explicitly demonstrates violence, and it depicts what seems to be a vulnerable older woman confronting a younger, archetypal neo-Nazi skinhead. The photograph was taken during a small demonstration of the Nordic Realm Party supporters on April 13, 1985, as approved by the authorities. The rally had been planned to be held shortly after the end of a public speech delivered by the Left Party communist leader Lars Werner in the center of Vaxjo, and skirmishes between left-wing protesters and neo-Nazis began even before the start of the far-right demonstration. Rönsson's photograph was published the next day on the front page of the Swedish national newspaper Dagens Nyheter, and on April 15th by two British newspapers, The Times and Daily Express. Another photograph taken by Rönsson during the event shows the 10 neo-Nazis being chased, pelted with eggs, and violently confronted by a crowd made up of hundreds of attendants of the left-wing rally, joined by local Vaxjo residents. One of the neo-Nazis was kicked unconscious on the ground, then saved by one of the protesters who reportedly took pity on him. The far-right activists eventually managed to shelter in the toilets of the city's train station, hiding there for a few hours until the police transported them. The picture was selected as the Swedish Picture of the Year, 1985, and later as the Picture of the Century by the magazine V and the Photographic Historical Society of Sweden. The photograph was produced using gelatin silver process and edition by gallerist Pell Unger. 12 copies, 3AP and 3PP, have been produced in the size 58 by 80 centimeters, or, for us Americans, 23 inch by 31 inch, and the prices range between 1,000 euros, 3,000 euros as of July 2020. Now, the one thing that I will say as we bring this, the one thing that I will say about this last entry is that I think it's for me, it's emblematic of and why I like these sorts of videos. So for this entry, we got a history of the event, of the image, a little bit of an analysis, and then a very detailed explanation of the medium, you know, how the photo was taken and how it's been reproduced. And I really enjoyed that. That is the perfect way to end this level 1 of our photographs iceberg. All right, y'all, that is the end of our part 1 of this iceberg. I'm very happy to make it to the end. I really have enjoyed this process a ton. So let's look forward to our first part of level 2 of this photographs iceberg. But until then, take care, everyone. Stay safe, stay hydrated, go on a hike, get some sunlight, and I'll see you guys in the next video.